Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest in the series of Fireside Chats. We're happy to be able to continue bringing you this series of informational webinars, keeping you up to date with current news in these ever-changing times we're living in. My name is Joshua Gilstrap. I'm a marketing specialist with E2B and C2B Technologies. I'll be your host today, and we're talking with Jeff Leach, the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the One EDI Source division of Epicor. Jeff has nearly 20 years of experience in the supply chain and manufacturing sectors, including roles as plant manager for a tier 1 automotive company, production and materials manager in the aerospace and defense sector, and as a senior manager at the mid-market manufacturing practice at Deloitte. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Josh.
Before we begin, we were thinking that we'd like to start with a couple of poll questions, as we usually do, to kind of gauge the audience and see how everybody's relating to this particular subject matter. I think we have our first one. Have you ever experienced disruptions in your supply chain caused by the pandemic? And feel free to answer as you go. Give everybody a few seconds to round that out. Well, we got one. It's a yes. I'm going to probably go with anybody that's following along that is definitely a yes, that has affected our supply chain. As we all noticed from grocery stores, kind of as we jumped into this, I believe toilet paper was the big hot button way back when it just kind of ran out everywhere. We couldn't have predicted that kind of a need or run on that, I should say. So I think that was pretty universal going through this whole process. Second poll question we have is, how does your business manage your inventory currently? And we have some options on that one. I guess, Jeff, my question for you would be just, what would you say is the most common of the ones listed there for managing inventory?
So interesting question. Much of it depends on the size of company, but most companies actually in the mid-market, they're doing some kind of an inventory module in an ERP system, although there still are a fair amount of spreadsheets and small inventory apps out there as well. Sure.
Really is the glove that fits kind of thing. All right, well, let's move on to the meat of while we're here.
Yeah, so I have to tell you a story, Josh, as we get started here. You said something about toilet paper running out. Quick story. I was the week before Disney World shut down. I was sitting with my family at Indiana Jones, and we were I was talking to somebody in California, said they run out of toilet paper, and I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I'll go back to Ohio, where I'm at right now, and I'll ship you a truckload, and you can sell it out there." And guess what? When I got back to Ohio, we were out of it here too. Wow. So anyway,
That's crazy, Jeff. Yeah, we were all kind of struggling with that, I found, but I just wanted to add to our panel, or our attendees. If you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll answer them as we round out the end of this discussion. Okay, Jeff. So first question, we're going to dive right in. How will supply chains be affected by this pandemic we're living in moving forward?
Boy, is that the $65 million question? It's even more than $64 million. Well, Josh, we learned a lot in the last 6 months as supply chain management and managers. We learned that basically every supply chain was affected. It didn't matter who you were, what industry you were in. Shortages were the first things that hit. And then after that, demand spiked, and the demand couldn't be met. If you look at places like aerospace and defense, they were hit because of single sourcing, and retail was hit because much of retail supply comes from China. Pharmaceuticals were hit because of raw materials out of India, and healthcare equipment was hit greatly because of the whole idea of FDA and certifications and recertifying your downstream suppliers and so forth. And smaller suppliers or smaller customers were hit even worse than the large ones were, because during this period, production was lower in a factory. So a factory, for example, it might have produced 1,000 widgets a day, was running 300 a day. And they were sending those widgets to their preferred clients, and their preferred clients were typically very large clients who were a major portion of their revenue. So the mid-market got hit pretty heavily. In fact, 7 out of 10 exporters to the U.S. that sent out 7 out of the 10 top exporters to the U.S. Stopped shipping altogether, and 50 countries either closed or partially closed their borders. So we learned things like our efficiency gains of the past, where we had done things like, say, single sourcing and offshoring and single sets of tooling. That bit us, because if we had a single supplier, or we had a single set of tooling, and that person who had the tooling in their possession, or that supplier or that region was shut down, then we were dead in the water. Mm-hmm. And what we think is going to happen, and what all the prognosticators is saying, is that there's going to be more regional supply chain when this is all over. Local, more onshoring. There's going to be multi-sourcing. There's going to be, you got to work really hard to create a trusted network of suppliers. In essence, quite frankly, the whole supply chain is going to be topsy-turvy for probably the next 2 or 3 years. People settle in with their new suppliers or in the new regional supply base, and then start back managing them again.
Sure. No, that totally makes sense. I mean, I think that the single source thing is the biggest takeaway that I'm hearing from that with regard to it really disrupting the entire chain. And that kind of leads us into our next question, was what are the disruptions within the chain in these businesses based on that, and how can they improve the model moving forward? And I think you just hit on it. Go regional, stay local, have diversify your supply chain so that you don't have a single source anymore.
That's true, and it's those are kind of the, how do I want to say it? They're the little thing. They're not little, but they're the micro things that you have to do. Mm-hmm. But you still have to think at a macro level, because you still have to worry about developing and managing those new suppliers. So you're going to hear things like country plus one suppliers, or risk and exception based suppliers, or locations of suppliers that are closer to you. Well, and multiple suppliers, they have to be managed. Sure. and they have to be I'm sorry, go ahead.
Risk involved with that, I guess, is kind of what you're getting at from a macro standpoint. Like, where is this shift in dynamic going to really take them, and how do you manage that risk?
Exactly. And you know that old adage about you got to plan to plan. And I hate that, but it's true. In this case, maybe more so than anything we've done, at least in my lifetime, and I'm an old guy and been in the supply chain space for a long, long time. We really have to sit down as supply chain managers and as suppliers even to customers and say, listen, we've got to create a disruption or a risk management program that really understands all of the aspects and all the nuances that could occur, not just because of COVID. COVID just happened to be probably the worst thing, other than maybe 9/11, probably the worst thing that's happened in my lifetime with respect to supply chain. But we've had in the recent years, we've had tsunamis, we've had hurricanes, we've had tornadoes, and then we've had this global pandemic and even smaller kind of regional pandemics that have caused problems. This just happens to be the worst one and the one that we're in the middle of right now.
Sure. And there's no real sign that it's going to be closing or finishing or wrapping up anytime soon. So
yeah, unfortunately, I think that may be true.
Yeah, they keep giving it to us in like 3-month chunks. Like, oh, just give me the next 3 months, the next 3 months, and I don't see it kind of coming to an end anytime before even into next year. So I guess jumping into the next question, I would ask, what are the benefits of drawbacks? Like, so you've mentioned a couple of them, but are there any more that you can think of for benefits versus drawbacks of sourcing locally versus globally outside of the pandemic, perhaps?
So the benefits are, I don't want to say they're obvious, but they're kind of obvious. They're obvious when someone writes them down on a piece of paper for us, right? And we're going to be bringing more flexibility into our supply chain, especially if we have multiple suppliers who are local or global. We're going to be creating greater control. We're going to have greater control over our supply chains. There are some areas where we're going to reduce costs, so reduce shipping costs. We're going to reduce risk. And little sidebar, I read an article last week, I think it was, might have been by McKinsey, doesn't matter, but they were talking about localized supply chains actually reducing our carbon footprint and being good on the environment because there's not going to be as much shipping and so forth going around. But mainly what we really have to understand is that bringing it closer from a benefit perspective is going to add resiliency to our supply chain. There are some drawbacks though, and I would say the biggest drawback is the fact that we have restricted our pool of suppliers. And what does that mean? That means that we've restricted those who can provide the things that we want to only a few instead of global suppliers. There'll be less competition for our business, which could drive prices up. And there's a larger pool of intellectual property and smart people out there if you look globally than there is locally. So we lose that, and we also lose exposure to markets outside of our local market if in fact we're trying to sell to those global markets. So there are some significant drawbacks to that. What we really need to understand, and you may hear me say this 2 or 3 times while we're talking today, we've got to understand that we are going to drive resiliency into our supply chain, which in the short run, we as supply chain managers need to make everybody understand that could drive some efficiency out of it, and that could drive some costs into it. But over the long run, we're going to be in a better place with our company and being able to keep our company's stock shelved and or factories running, whatever the case may be.
Sure. So with that in mind, visibility within the supply chain, how can these businesses begin to add to that to make it easier for them to track, to see what's working and what's not?
Yeah, great question. It's not so much about visibility as it is about actionable and time sensitive visibility. Because one could say I've got visibility if I have a notebook that's filled with POs and I line out the things that have been received, which by the way, when I started out in this business, that's kind of what we did, right? We sent a PO out, and then when something came in, we kind of lined through it and said, yep, they got, my vendor has 20 more of these to ship me before this PO is done. I better get them a new PO. You can make a case that with faxes and notebooks and pieces of paper, you've got visibility, but it's not very actionable, and it's definitely not time sensitive. So the first step you really have to do, and we all have to do as supply chain individuals, is we've got to digitize our supply chain. And that means all up and down the supply chain, even the smallest suppliers. You said before that I used to be an OEM. plant manager for an OEM,
Mm-hmm.
automotive, tier one automotive. You know, in my factory, one of the things, I had two factories. One was a stamping plant and one was an assembly plant that actually took those stampings and built frame rails, or built frames for vans for GM. Okay. Heavy vans, mid-tier trucks. And, you know, a bolt, if I had a specialized hardened fastener in my factory, that could shut down my factory just as quickly as an engine could. And why is that? Because that bolt only comes from one place. So even though it's a small supplier and maybe small items that they supply to me, I've got to integrate them too, because they can shut me down just as fast as anyone else can. So we've got to start with good, real-time, accurate data, and that's the first step of visualizing our supply, and we've got to do it across our entire supply chain.
Sure. And how does that add a competitive advantage, having this visibility? Like, what kind of competitive advantages do you get from it?
Yeah, so again, you know, I'm sure many of us feel this way, but as a tier one supplier, to automotive and other companies, but automotive is a very strict industry, if you will. When I shut down the GM assembly plant at the time, it was in Detroit, it's not there anymore. They charged me $100,000 an hour for every late part that went to that plant. Yeah, it's big, but it wasn't about that as much as it was about the fact that I made myself they didn't like me anymore. And the next time a contract came up, they'd sit back and say, hey, listen, you know, you guys shut down my plant 3 times in the last year. You know, what are you doing to fix that? So, so what does that all culminate in what we're talking about today? What it means is that we have to understand what our customers' needs are, and we have to be able to fulfill their needs, and we have to be able to change to their needing demand, the change in their demand. So how do we become more competitive by digitizing our supply chain? First of all, if our customers have digitized us, then we're going to find out very quickly what changes are being made at the customer's facilities, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be retail, whatever the case may be. You know, if you ran out of toilet paper, you're going to know about it. You know, if you're digitized much faster than if you wait for the next PO to come through. But in order, that being understood, you know, how am I going to be more competitive? I'm going to be more competitive because I'm going to be able to respond to my customers' changes in demand much more quickly. And I'm also going to know that my suppliers are able to respond to my customers' change in demand. And so as I digitize up and down the supply chain, what that does is that makes me more able to meet my customers' demands and the changes that they may have, which makes me more competitive.
Absolutely. So I guess that kind of leads us right into the next one. How would you suggest these paper-based companies begin that shift towards the digital frontier?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is we really have to understand which one of our suppliers are critical suppliers. You know, I talked about that bolt a moment ago on the factory floor. You know, that bolt was a specialized bolt. On the other hand, if all I needed was a 1/2-inch carriage bolt, and I ran out of that, I could go down to the local hardware store and pick one up. Sure. So there is this concept of critical suppliers, and those are the ones we need to start with. And then we keep chipping away until all of our suppliers are integrated. But you really have to do it quickly. So in saying we have to do it quickly, that doesn't mean that we can create, you know, I've got a list of 200 suppliers. I'm going to hit 10 in the next quarter and 10 in the next quarter and 10 in the next quarter. Much of that approach to the clients that we've worked with over the years has been because of the client's ability to participate in an onboarding project, if you will. So I would suggest anybody who wants to push very hard for this, and that should be, quite frankly, anybody who wants to be competitive, should really go out and look at someone who can help them to do this, who has solutions that can integrate the small supplier without making the small supplier spend a lot of money, without making the small supplier have to do integration work that he or she may not know how to. So how do you do that? Well, you do that with, we call it a supplier hub, but there are others out there, but you do it with what we call the supplier hub, which is onboarding them into a web portal that all they need is a web browser, an email, and an internet, and they can receive your POs, and they can respond to them with ASNs. They can respond to them and say, yep, I can ship on time, or no, I can't, or I can ship half of that load this week and half of it next week. Is that okay? And then finally, push invoices through. And then for the well, those suppliers who can actually do system-to-system integration, we can do that with an integration hub and provide our customers and the hub, if you will, the company who's doing the integration that's at the top of the supply chain, visibility into all of that. And we can do it very quickly and bring on literally hundreds of suppliers in weeks by doing it in a controlled and project managed approach. So back to your question, I know that was kind of a long way around, but the first question is identify the major suppliers that are critical to your business and go onboard them first. But at the same time, we can be onboarding the little guys and the folks who are system-to-system integrations too, very quickly and very well with some external help. Sorry about that, guys. That's the hazards of working at home, as you get phone calls coming at you, right? Okay.
No, that's great, Jeff. What I heard in the middle of that actually, which I guess maybe if there were people in the middle of the chain, obviously suppliers are going to be pushing downstream because that's the only direction they can for digitizing. Consumers are pushing upstream because that's where they go. But the manufacturers in the middle, you're suggesting if they have both directions to go, you go supplier first and then to consumer if you're kind of in the center of that chain.
Well, so a lot of, oftentimes that's the way it flushes out, because a customer may drive you as a I'll call it tier one supplier. Let's say it's your Walmart, if you're a supplier to Walmart, Walmart's going to tell you will connect with me with EDI, whether you like it or not. If you want to do business with me, that's what you're going to do. And a lot of big guys at the top of the, 800-pound gorillas, if you will, at the top of the supply chain, that's what they're going to do. On the other hand, we've got many cases where people who are suppliers have reached out to their customers and said, hey, I know you don't require me to do this, but I've got capabilities to integrate with you, and I'd like to do that. And those customers say, heck yeah. I wish I'd known this a long time ago. And that goes back to that question you had earlier about how do you become more competitive. If you can go out to your customers and say, I've got this capability, how about it? And they say, heck yeah, you just put yourself in a better position than your competitors are.
Absolutely. Since you mentioned competitive advantage again, one of the rounding out questions I've got here is, what are the ROI metrics that you would use to gauge the success of digitizing in this platform?
Great question. So probably the number one thing we've heard in the last 10 years is delivering the perfect order. Okay. And that means that the order is exactly what the customer shipped. The materials are there on time. The invoices match the order, all of that stuff. So my first statement would be, because it's so important, is a percentage of perfect orders. So if your perfect order percentage is 70%, and quite frankly that's good in a lot of industries, you want to see that go up. So the percentage of perfect orders, the number of days to shipment from the order. So how quickly after the customer has changed an order are you able to ship to that? In the paper world, you just think about it. I sat with a client years ago who did everything with paper. And this order would come in, and they thought fax, bringing in a fax, that was electronic, right? And that's okay. So this fax order came in, and it sat on the fax machine for half a day. Then someone from the mailroom went and got all the faxes off the machine, and went out and distributed them. And it sat in somebody's inbox for another, day or two before that inbox got to it. And then after that was done, I keyed it into my system, and now I've got an order on the shop floor. So you lose a couple of days before that order is even recognized by the shop that it can be shipped. And that's not unusual. So how quickly can you respond to your customers' orders and order changes? How about on-time deliveries, and knowing when you need to ship? So for example, I talked a little bit ago about our supplier hub and our integration hub. Well, our supplier hub and integration hub sits on top, an advanced intelligence engine that sits on top of it that can spit off emails to you and say, hey, you got something that you're supposed to ship tomorrow. Maybe you better get on the ball here. So on-time deliveries is one. Those are kind of customer facing things. As the person who is trying to push it on your supplier, you should be talking about things like the percent of connected suppliers, the percentage of deliveries handled by technology, the revenue change associated with digital versus non-digital supply. That's how you tell if your program is picking up steam and is going. But if you get right down to it, it's all about servicing that client, which is that perfect order. It's that on-time delivery. It's that number of days shipments. It's the number of stock outs that your client has. Those are the things that you really measure yourself on.
Absolutely, yeah, and visibility, begets that. So it's digital is definitely the clearer picture with regard to supply chain. And I think this pandemic, if anything, has kind of catapulted that into the forefront of people's minds. If there can be anything good that's coming out of it, it's definitely is pushing us in the right direction faster than we may have before.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I want to thank you, Jeff, for your insights today. I really appreciate you coming in. We really hope that this information has been helpful to all of you who attended. And we really look forward to seeing you on our next fireside chat, which, bear with me, I believe is August 6th, same time. So if there's anything else, do you have anything else to add, Jeff?
No, I just want to wish you all to be safe, and we thank you for participating today, and I enjoyed my time. If you have any questions, I'm always around to help.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Bye, all.